Welcome to Outrage Science Bites, where we explore the science behind outrage, political polarization, and the ways modern media is fueling division, all in bite-sized episodes. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer. This week's theme is the psychology of polarization, the science behind our toxic political environment. We're starting off with the root causes of political polarization, understanding the psychological drivers. Many of us see some particular source as the root problem causing our deep divide, whether it's the partisan media, social media, the two-party system, or something else. All of these things play a role, but there is no single culprit. Ultimately, our toxic divide is driven by a complex interplay of cognition and context. In this episode, we're focusing on the cognition side, the deep psychological roots that interact with social, technological, and political factors. We won't be able to go into deep details in this area. We have produced dozens and dozens of episodes of the long-form Outrage Overload podcast, and we still haven't covered everything on this topic, but we'll hit the high points. First up is tribalism and group identity. Humans have an innate tendency to form in-groups and out-groups, a trait rooted in our evolutionary past. In the political context, this manifests as strong partisan identities, where people view their political affiliation as a core part of who they are. This tribal mentality fosters solidarity within the group but breeds suspicions and prejudice towards those perceived as outsiders. Here's Dr. Stephen Rathje.
Experiments in something called social identity theory, which was developed by Henry Tajfeld, I believe, sort of in the 1970s. And Tajfeld did a number of experiments where he would basically randomly assign people to two different teams using a flip of a coin. There'd be no reason for this team assignment. It would be completely arbitrary. And he found, and he was also surprised by this, he found that people would start automatically discriminating against the other team. They would want to allocate more money to their team and not give money to the other team. They would sort of automatically just feel a sense of group membership, even if the group membership was arbitrary. So this research really established that we tend to just automatically identify with groups that we are a part of, which we call the in-group, and we automatically tend to discriminate against groups that we are not a part of, called the outgroup. This seems to be sort of just part of our human psychology. It might be part of our evolved psychology since we evolved within sort of these small groups of people. And a lot of people use this in-group and out-group language to describe a lot of political phenomena nowadays, because a lot of people's engagement with politics doesn't seem necessarily to be rational or based on policy preferences. Instead, a lot of it seems to be based on identity and team membership. We treat it almost like a sports game nowadays.
Next, there's affective polarization, the tendency for people to view opposing partisans negatively and co-partisans positively. This emotional response often overrides rational policy considerations, leading to a visceral dislike of the other side, regardless of specific issues. Here's Liliana Mason describing affective polarization.
So now we don't just hate people in the other party because we disagree on the marginal tax rate. We hate them because they are different from us in so many ways. And that's social, that's affective, that's cultural, that's all right. They are different from us in all these ways. And we feel that really viscerally. It's not just that we disagree, that we feel really like those people are not like me. And we shouldn't even be necessarily, in the same country, right? They shouldn't count as Americans as much as my people count as Americans. So that's a very bad way to do politics, but it does explain how we are currently doing politics.
It's fair to question whether affective polarization is a root cause or more of a result of other underlying factors. Based on the research, affective polarization appears to be both a consequence of other dynamics and a contributing factor to further polarization, creating a complex feedback loop. Once established, it contributes to further polarization in several ways. It strengthens partisan identities, making people more likely to view political affiliation as a core part of who they are. Some studies suggest that affective polarization can influence support for undemocratic candidates and cause people to not hold their politicians accountable. Finally, there are a number of cognitive biases that contribute to polarization. We've talked about many of these on Outrage Science Bites episodes, but a few of these include confirmation bias, where people seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs while dismissing contradictory evidence. Negativity bias, where negative information and emotions tend to have a stronger impact than positive ones, fueling hostility towards opposing groups. Motivated reasoning, where people interpret information in ways that support their pre-existing views and group identity. We have also covered these topics in more depth with experts on the Outrage Overload podcast. In summary, a few of the main psychological drivers contributing to our deep divide are tribalism and group identity, affective polarization, and cognitive biases. These psychological tendencies interact with environmental factors to shape polarized beliefs and attitudes. In upcoming episodes, we'll explore ways to overcome these toxic divides. Thank you for listening to Outrage Science Bites. If you enjoyed this episode, you may want to check out the long-form Outrage Overload podcast. Visit outrageoverload.net for past episodes, links, and contact information. Be sure to tune in tomorrow as we continue this series on the psychology of polarization.